So there's been another coronavirus death in Australia overnight. A man in his 60s died in Victoria, taking the state's toll to 16 and the national toll to 75. And the World Health Organization has warned the coronavirus pandemic is about to hit large parts of Africa, Central and South America and Eastern Europe. More than 2.5 million people have the illness worldwide and 183,000 have died. So here are some of the key developments today. The Ruby Princess cruise ship will leave Australia this afternoon, 5 weeks after it was allowed to dock in Sydney, triggering hundreds of coronavirus cases and 21 deaths. More witnesses will give evidence today to this special inquiry into the outbreak on the ship. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia needs to work with like-minded countries to get to the bottom of the origins of coronavirus. He's called for World Health Organization inspectors to be given more powers to root out infectious disease outbreaks. Chief Medical Officer Brendan Murphy is appearing before a Senate Select Committee investigating the government's response to the pandemic. Singapore now has more than 10,000 cases after another surge in infections among migrant workers. 11 people have died in Singapore and the country has extended a partial lockdown until June. And face masks are to become compulsory throughout Germany. While some states will not make them mandatory for people while shopping, everyone will have to wear coverings on public transport. The Ruby Princess cruise ship is about to leave New South Wales on orders from Border Force. Reporter Timothy Fernandez joins us now from Port Kembla, south of Sydney. Timothy, good morning. So what's the plan with the Ruby Princess today?
Well, good morning, Joe. Yes, the plan is for the Ruby Princess to depart Australian waters today. We're expecting a departure time of around 4 p.m. this afternoon, but that all just depends on what happens to the hundreds of crew that are expected to disembark today. We saw buses arrive at Port Kembla early this morning, and they're expected to ferry these crew up to Sydney hotels ahead of their boarding of chartered flights back to their home countries. But this operation, which has been running for the last couple of days, it depends on how long it's going to run. That will dictate what time the Ruby Princess can actually leave Port Kembla and Australian waters.
And what about the crew on board?
We understand there are more than 800 crew who remain on board. Like I said, hundreds of those will come off today and be sent to Sydney, but there are questions around what happens to the more than 100 crew who've tested positive for COVID-19. Now, 24 of those crew members came off yesterday and they were taken to hotels in Sydney where they've entered a quarantine period under the watch of New South Wales Health. But there are still more than 100 on board who have COVID-19. I spoke to the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Health, Ryan Park, who raised some concerns about the ship leaving with that many sick passengers on board. Here's what he had to say a little earlier.
The health and safety and welfare of the crew has always been paramount for us, and we need to give an assurance that that ship won't be allowed to leave whilst anyone on board may be at risk of COVID-19.
And Timothy, there's already an inquiry that started into what's happened with the Ruby Princess. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so the Special Commission of Inquiry got underway yesterday and we immediately heard some very compelling evidence by a senior doctor who still is on board the Ruby Princess, who appeared via video link, and she said she was surprised by the decision to allow 2,700 passengers to disembark at 3 a.m. in the morning on the 19th of March and reintegrate with the community. She says if it was up to her, she would have done things a little bit differently. We've also heard some evidence about what happened with the logbook of sicknesses on board before New South Wales Health gave the order for the ship to disembark. We've heard that that logbook was out of date when New South Wales Health received it, and it didn't contain instances of people with COVID-19 like symptoms. That was respiratory symptoms. That came out the day after the crew were allowed to, or the passengers rather, were allowed to disembark the ship. We are expected to, of course, hear more evidence today, and the full findings of this inquiry will come out in August this year.
Okay, Timothy Fernandez reporting there from Port Kembla, just south of Sydney. And the New South Wales Premier has faced a grilling from journalists over the Ruby Princess inquiry, which began hearings yesterday, as just said, with little warning to the public. Gladys Berejiklian says it would have been inappropriate for her to know about the proceedings before anyone else.
I think I made the point very clearly early on that this is an independent inquiry. I found out when everybody else did, and it would have been inappropriate for me to have found out any earlier.
And have any of your ministers been called to appear?
I don't know.
Do you think you made a mistake by not telling the public that it was on to have a secret inquiry? I thought we were about openness in this state. Why has Mr Walker made this move?
Well, you'd have to ask Mr Walker that. When I had
Why aren't you asking Mr Walker that? You're our representative.
Because it would be highly inappropriate for any member of government to suggest to Mr Walker on how he should conduct the inquiry. When you appoint a special...
That's not suggesting how he should conduct it. That's suggesting how he should be open about it.
Well, as far as I know, it was a public hearing.
Without making any suggestions to him, he didn't pick up the phone to you and say,
no.
By the way, Premier, we're starting tomorrow. He didn't do that on Wednesday night?
No.
You didn't find out on Wednesday night?
No.
No one in your office found out on Wednesday night?
And can I say it would have been inappropriate for him to advise me ahead of any other public disclosure he made. It is a matter for him on how he conducts the inquiry. Could you have imagined if he'd tried to contact anybody and told us? That would have been highly inappropriate. This is an independent, robust process. We have to respect that. Mr Walker is an eminent, highly qualified person, and I have full confidence he'll get to the bottom of what he needs to get to. I want the answers as much as anybody, but I will not have anybody interfering in the process.
Now, the Australian government is pushing for greater scrutiny of wildlife markets in response to coronavirus. It comes as the Prime Minister urges other global leaders to give the World Health Organization more power to investigate future pandemics. Political reporter Jade Macmillan joins us now from Canberra. Jade, g'day. So first, the issue of these wildlife markets. What does the government want to see happen there?
Well, the Australian government says there's a very real likelihood that coronavirus emerged from a wildlife wet market in the Chinese city of Wuhan, and it now wants international experts to scrutinise them. The Agriculture Minister, David Littleproud, has stressed that there is a difference between regular wet markets like you'd see in Australia, where various fresh food products are sold under the one roof, and then the wildlife wet markets that we see in China and other countries as well, where you've also got live exotic animals. Now, Mr Littleproud says that this is not a witch hunt, but he's told a virtual meeting of his G20 counterparts that governments need to acknowledge and understand the risks that these markets pose, not only to human health, but also to agricultural industries around the world.
It only makes sense that we go and investigate these wildlife wet markets to understand the risks that they pose to human health and also to biosecurity. It's a responsibility of all global nations to undertake this work in a scientific manner, in a calm and methodical way, to understand the risks and whether they can be mitigated.
And Jade, what kind of response has Scott Morrison received to his idea for the World Health Organization to be given greater powers?
Well, this is an idea that Mr Morrison has floated with a number of other world leaders in the past few days. He wants either the World Health Organization or another body to be given powers similar to those used by a weapons inspector to prevent the type of pandemic that we've seen with COVID-19. There has been widespread international concern about the amount of time that it took China to alert the rest of the world about the seriousness of coronavirus, and Australia has already called for a global inquiry into the origins of this pandemic. But Mr Morrison has now spoken to the US President Donald Trump, as well as German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Emmanuel Macron, pushing this idea as to what could be done to prevent this from happening again. There hasn't been a terribly enthusiastic response to this proposal so far. President Macron has said through an official that while there does need to be transparency from all involved, that now isn't the time to be looking at an investigation. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has also defended its handling of this crisis. It has hit back at accusations that it acted too slowly in declaring a global health emergency. It says it gave the world plenty of warning.
OK, Jade Macmillan reporting there from Canberra. OK, let's turn to the US now. Another 2,300 people have died in the US just in the past 24 hours. So the total death toll for the US now stands close to 48,000. US President Donald Trump is pushing to restart the economy, congratulating a handful of southern states for reopening non-essential industries. North America correspondent Catherine Diss reports.
These states that are choosing to push ahead with relaxing some of those social distancing guidelines and also allowing their economies to reopen would argue that they're on a much better footing than what other states like New York, for instance, are experiencing. Some of these states, all of them rather, are Republican. They're mostly in the South. They are deciding that the economic damage from those lockdown orders have been so profound and the impact on their citizens so great that it is better to move ahead and reopen their economies. We've seen some protests take place in a number of cities across America in recent days as people have demanded the right to go back to work. Georgia is probably relaxing the most. From the end of this week, you can get a haircut there or go to a movie theatre, whereas Tennessee, South Carolina and Texas have also moved ahead to relax their guidelines. In terms of why the president is weighing in, he's made it fairly clear that he'd like to see the economy back up and running by May the 1st. This would certainly make some steps towards doing that. He'd like to see the economy back up and running ahead of the general election in November, given one of his biggest re-election calling cards was the strength of the economy ahead of the coronavirus pandemic. But of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a rising death toll. Overnight, close to 3,000 people here lost their lives. More than 45,000 people have died overall. There are 830,000 cases. They continue to rise. And whilst testing has ramped up, only about 4% of the population has so far been tested.
So a clearer picture is emerging of the impact of coronavirus on care homes across the UK. To date, the official count in the UK has only factored in deaths in hospitals. Europe correspondent Linton Besser reports from London.
We know that the official death toll, and there's a daily briefing given by a cabinet minister in which various slides are released. All of those numbers are based on what can be counted, and that is who has died in a hospital ward or in an intensive care unit. And of course, the national death toll in Britain is now more than 18,000 people. It's a staggering number. But there have been various reports starting to examine the difference between the average number of deaths that we would ordinarily see in Britain at this time of year compared to right now, putting aside these coronavirus cases. And those numbers are soaring. There's been an analysis done by the Financial Times, for example, where they've done exactly that. They've extrapolated the difference between, the usual mortality trend and what's happening now. And their analysis suggests the true number of deaths from this virus might not be 18,000 in Britain, but more than 40,000.
Linton Besser reporting there. Singapore now has more than 10,000 cases of coronavirus after another surge in infections among migrant workers. Scores of crowded dormitories housing around 20,000 foreign workers have become breeding grounds for COVID-19. Migrant workers account for more than 3/4 of Singapore's infections. The country has the highest number of cases in Southeast Asia. 11 people have died and the city-state has extended a partial lockdown until June. There are signs that the Brazilian city of Manaus in the Amazon basin is struggling to deal with the number of deaths from coronavirus. The mayor's office says workers in the city's largest cemetery have been forced to dig mass graves to deal with a 50% increase in demand. Refrigerated trucks are being used to house coffins until they can be buried. So Manaus is a city on the Amazon River in Brazil, about 1,600 kilometres inland, in the very heart of Amazon country there in Brazil. Now, more than 70,000 troops will be deployed in South Africa to help enforce coronavirus lockdown measures. South Africa has recorded 3,500 coronavirus cases and 58 deaths. The country has some of the most stringent lockdown restrictions in the world, but security forces have struggled to enforce them. Spain's parliament has approved a request from the Prime Minister to extend the coronavirus lockdown until May the 10th. The country, one of the worst hit in the world, has been under severe restrictions for more than 5 weeks. Spain's outbreak has stabilised, but the Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, has warned that any easing of the measures needs to be done extremely carefully. There's expected to be a 6% drop in global carbon emissions this year because of the pandemic. The World Meteorological Organization believes the reduction will be short-lived and is warning it higher emissions growth could be on the cards. The world has marked its 50th Earth Day, with conservationists saying we should stop taking the planet for granted.